Bride of Frankenstein.
The monster's bride does not actually end up marrying him. In fact, she's pretty much fully against the very idea of it, and it was extremely presumptuous on the part of the mad scientists to spend all that time making a woman just to assume she would go along with everything. The disregard of female agency is just one of the many flaws of this film, and I cannot understand why it's ranked so highly among fans of the old Universal horror series. This character alone was enough to ruin the movie for me. The space kook would cringe from this actress's screeching. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. Wait a minute, I have one quick correction to make. In a previous video, I gave the ghost of Casey O'Reilly a Doo score of 3.3 out of 5 when it should have been 3.2 out of 5. Kudos to YouTube viewer John C. 1782 for catching my math mistake. This is why I f***ing hate math. Math.
Scooby, Scooby-Doo, Scooby, Scooby-Doo.
The gang are in Transylvania, where Daphne hears reports that the Frankenstein monster is running amok and terrorizing the community. Determined to prove the old legend was just a hoax, she convinces Shaggy and the dogs to take on a babysitting job at the castle at the center of the story, now under new ownership. The infamous Count Dracula. Will they solve the monster mystery, or end up as its latest victims? Unfortunately, this is another Scooby episode without any actual villain, despite being filled with monsters straight out of a 1940s horror movie. So, like before, all I can do is give some of my thoughts on what's seen on screen. Right off the bat, I'm going to be calling Frankenstein's monster simply Frankenstein. Insisting on referring to the creature as Frankenstein's monster is not only cumbersome, but also fruitlessly pedantic, as most people have been referring to it as Frankenstein for decades. Yes, Frankenstein was the creator and not the creature, and those who argue the point are technically correct.
Technically correct. The best kind of correct.
However, despite the monster never having been given an official name in the original source novel, pop culture has filled in that blank repeatedly over the years, cementing Frankenstein as both the name of the creator and his monster. I'm okay with it, really, since in many ways the creature was essentially the son of the Mad Doctor, and kids usually adopt their parents' surname.
This is Transylvania. All big monsters live here.
When do we leave?
Not until we prove once and for all that all this Frankenstein legend is a hoax. Can you direct us to Frankenstein's castle?
As tempting as it is for many here in the United States to believe otherwise, Transylvania is a real location, and not some made-up land of ghosts and goblins because it's been used so often in spooky media as the setting for such things. Transylvania is a large region in central Romania, which means the citizens there speak, Romanian. Why were those signs in English?
Well, this ought to do the trick. Wanted, babysitters. Inquire at the old Frankenstein castle.
Oh boy, that's the place, all right.
Why was that community board in... You know what? I'm calling it here. Everything is going to be in English, which doesn't make any sense, but if I dwell too much on that point, I'll lose the narrative. Engaging, willing suspension, disbelief.
No thanks, Daff. We're not babysitting for the Frankensteins.
Shaggy says that now, but in just a few more years.
Oh, but the Frankensteins moved out of the castle years ago.
So who lives there now?
Dracula.
This is where we're going to prove it's all fake.
Yes?
Count Dracula?
Correct.
Do come in, all of you.
I'm really confused. Shaggy and Scooby clearly know who and what Dracula is. It stands to reason that Daphne would as well, but is she so focused on proving that the Frankenstein legend wasn't real that she's ignoring a literal vampire? In fact, the franchise-defining vampire right in front of her. Does this put Daphne on the spectrum?
Honey buns! Great news! We've got new babysitters.
How exciting! Junior will be simply delighted.
Wait a minute. That hair would make her the bride of Frankenstein, essentially a flesh golem, not a lady vampire. Either Hanna-Barbera can't keep their Universal monster design straight, or there are some freaky 1970s swinger-type shenanigans happening in the Transylvania adult monster community.
Make sure Junior brushes his fangs.
We won't be late. Ta-ta!
I sure hope these new babysitters don't vanish like the old one did.
Frankie baby, she's gone. Let her go. You'll just need to find someone else. Most graveyards are filled with roddy hotties.
There goes the baby, Scoob. Your turn to check him out.
Oh, okay.
This episode was rife with animation errors and off-model characters, and I generally don't like to turn my videos into a showcase for them, but I have to ask, where in the hell is Shaggy's other leg?
No time, baby. Rumple-roop. Scooby, come in.
Wait a minute. Dracula is a vampire, and his wife is probably a zombie. But their kid is a werewolf? There are definitely some freaky 1970s swinger-type shenanigans happening in the Transylvania adult monster community.
The baby, it's a monster.
Like, don't be ridiculous. I'll show you myself. There's nothing to be scared of.
Come on, Shaggy. You of all people should believe Scooby when he says he saw a monster, considering all the times nobody believed the two of you. Also, you're literally in Transylvania and in Frankenstein's castle. And the baby's father is Count Dracula. Why wouldn't it be a monster?
I wonder what it controls.
Let's find out.
Ha! That's what all the little kids do at family gatherings after I turn on the dog whistle app on my smartphone. I'm a monster.
Make sure Junior brushes his fangs.
We won't be late. Ta-ta! Ah, home at last.
I wonder how our new babysitters are doing.
Dracula and his wife were gone for maybe half an hour by the show's reckoning. They weren't kidding about not being gone late, but where exactly did they go for dinner for them to arrive, order, eat, and get home in such a short amount of time? It had to have been a fast food joint. If that's Dracula's idea of a night out with his wife, them having a werewolf baby is starting to make a lot more sense. Larry Talbot obviously knows where to give his dates a good meal.
His brain solenoids are short-circuited, but don't worry, Frankie. We'll have you fixed up in no time.
Yeah, those two are still hooking up. Is it Dracula or Dracucula?
His homing device is leading us to the top of the tower, Scrappy.
I'll bet it has something to do with Frankenstein.
The Frankenstein hoax, you mean?
Woman, you just met Count Dracula. In an earlier episode, you were literally washed out of a haunted house by a ghost ocean, and you saw the actual golden fleece from Greek mythology. Frankenstein is the least unlikely thing you can experience now.
We'll start the recharge at the count of 3.
1, 2, 3.
Frankie, it's over now. How do you feel?
What in the hemorrhaging was that sound effect. The joke was Frankenstein's brain was switched with the ducks, so why did they use a synthesizer beep and not an actual duck quack? And this wasn't a one-off.
And it looks like Frankenstein will never go wild again.
See what I mean? Again, why that sound effect?
Well, looks like Junior has a new babysitter now.
This appears to be happening in the middle of the day. Why isn't Dracula burning up like a Texan cult leader? The gang travel to Paris so Daphne can cover the bicentennial of a famous culinary school. Unfortunately, they're unable to snag an immediate interview with headmistress, currently occupied with preparing for that evening's celebratory dinner. To make matters worse, her students have been dropping out in droves due to the appearance of a ghost, the spirit of a chef who seemingly nursed a grudge against the institution he founded. The headmistress lucked out, however, as the young interlopers have a bit of a knack for solving such supernatural shenanigans. Unlike how the animators portrayed New York City as being as barren as the soul of a billionaire, Paris appeared to be the bustling metropolis that it is. However, in real life, there is no major thoroughfare that runs under the Eiffel Tower. That would be like turning the Statue of Liberty into a drawbridge.
Paris, isn't it beautiful?
Like, ask me again when I've got a better view. How much farther anyway?
Why, of all things, is Shaggy carrying a tripod and what looks to be a dollhouse? But the better question is, why not store all this stuff in the pocket dimension next to the bicocopter? They were, after all, on their way to snag an interview, and not simply acting as tourists. Where were they going to put all that stuff after reaching the school? Gustav was one of the chefs employed by the Academy Versailles. He discovered that a disused banquet hall in the centuries-old building contained a trove of valuable artwork secreted inside a hidden panel. Deciding to keep the treasure for himself, he dressed as the ghost of the school's founder, Chef Marat, to drive away the students and staff, presumably to achieve unfettered access to the secret chamber. The Académie Versailles, or rather l'Académie de Versailles, is a real thing in France, but it's not a dedicated culinary arts school. Instead, it's a conglomeration of many different types of educational facilities, which, admittedly, does include chef training. I'm just not sure if the Scooby writers knew that when they wrote the script, or they just tossed in a school name that sounded French. They do have a history of not exactly getting foreign stuff correct. This is another classic Scooby villain scheme, and by classic, I mean bougie as balls. Bad guy finds a treasure where he works and dresses as a ghost to shut the place down. No plan gets more basic than that.
So it's the old scare 'em away so you can steal the treasure gag, eh, Scoob?
See what I mean? Even Shaggy called out Gustav for his lack of imagination. And as is often the case with such a plot, the bad guy made it that much harder for himself than if he had just quietly smuggled the treasure out of the secret compartment one painting at a time. To be fair, the audience was left in the dark when it came to the nature of the treasure or how easy it would be for others to discover it. Not that this was atypical for the Scooby franchise at this point. After all, an 11-minute episode doesn't allow for a lot of exposition or background flavor. But in any event, it would have helped to know two things: the origin of the artwork and how Gustav discovered the stash.
The Académie Versailles, the oldest cooking school in France. That's why we came, to cover the Academy's 200th birthday celebration.
This episode aired in 1983, which would put the year of the Académie Versailles' founding in 1783. That was the year the United States signed a treaty with Great Britain, coincidentally in Paris, that formally ended the American Revolutionary War.
Nerd!
Serendipitously, this was also just a few years before the start of France's own revolution. It's unlikely that Chef Marat would have safely weathered the storm of upheaval had he remained in the country during the rise of Robespierre. where even the lowliest of maidservants in wealthy households were put to the guillotine. Could Chef Marat have been an art collector and hidden his paintings inside the walls of his school before he fled Paris, hoping to one day reclaim his possessions? Did he die on foreign soil before he could return? Or was he caught by the Revolutionary Tribunal, joining Louis XVI and so many others on their final day at the Place de la Concorde?
Where did this ghost come from?
He is the ghost of Chef Marat, the school's founder. He started haunting us when we reopened his private banquet room for the first time in 200 years.
Wait a minute. As mentioned, the Academy Versailles was preparing for a celebration marking the 200th anniversary of the founding of the school. Madame Latorte just said that they were opening up the school's banquet hall for the first time in 200 years. That would mean Chef Marat built the place with a private banquet hall that he had never actually opened. Not to be mean, but do the Scooby writers ever give their scripts a final read-through before turning them in? Had the school's founder put the artwork in the hidden chamber himself, it would explain why the hall had been disused for so long. But it's also possible that the treasure had nothing to do with him or the Academy. Perhaps the paintings had been stolen from a museum or private collector years after the school was founded, and the thieves chose a long unused room in the school to stash their loot. It's also possible that the secret panel was installed during World War II, just before the Germans occupied Paris, to be used as a hiding spot for valuable French artwork to avoid being destroyed or looted by the Nazis. I am so focused on this aspect of the treasure source because it could have had a direct impact on Gustav's motivation for dressing as the ghost and his desperation to drive others away while he worked to steal it. If the paintings were merely a forgotten hoard whose origins were lost in the mists of time, Gustav should not have had a reason to worry about getting them out so quickly that he needed to scare others away by dressing as the ghost of Chef Marat. The villain had all the time in the world to find a way to sneak them out from under the noses of Madame Latorte and the rest of the faculty. Gustav could have wrapped them up in paper and pretended they were serving trays that he was taking to the kitchen. Or he could have simply stacked them as is under a covered trolley. After hours, he could then roll the trolley outside, where he would then load the artwork into the back of a van. If, however, the artwork had been stashed inside the hidden panel by contemporary thieves, Gustav would have felt a lot more pressure to move them before the crooks came back to retrieve their loot. Indeed, Gustav himself might have been a part of that gang and been attempting to betray his cohorts to keep all the paintings for himself.
Whoa! Ariel!
If Gustav had been an innocent employee of the Academy Versailles who just happened to find the hidden panel, perhaps while wiping down the walls in preparation for the bicentennial dinner, that could account for his desperation to close the school and cancel all festivities. The villain might have reasoned that if he had found the panel so easily, anyone else could too, so his time was limited. The fact that it's so easily opened when Gustav slammed into it at the end of the episode does lend credence to that idea. Then again, it's also possible it took pressing a secret switch on the wall to open it, and the bad guy's body just happened to hit it as he was flung at the wall. Knowing the source of the paintings would have also been helpful when it came to determining their value. I've spoken at length before about how tricky it is to fence stolen artwork, especially when the pieces are famous enough that any legitimate buyer or appraiser would immediately realize they had been stolen. Rather than rehash this, I'll just take it as read that if someone would go through the trouble of hiding all those paintings in this manner, they had to have been worth the hassle and risk of Gustav's scheme. I'm further willing to give Gustav the benefit of the doubt that he had not known of the paintings beforehand and stumbled onto them while alone in the unused banquet hall. I would also give him points for his quick thinking of coming up with the ghost of the school's founder to prevent others from discovering the hidden treasure. The only real negative of his scheme is that it was extremely unoriginal, even if we hand-wave that it's nearly impossible for the writers not to retread premises this far into the franchise. Gustav also had better options for smuggling out the goods without resorting to costumed shenanigans. He gets a 3 out of 5 for the design. The ghost of Chef Marat was, on the surface, an appropriate disguise, considering it had a direct link to the location it haunted. However, the motivation of the spirit was questionable. Typically, buildings are inhabited by vengeful spirits who simply want to be left alone, or were tormented while they were living and are now just raging balls of ectoplasmic enmity. Chef Marat, on the other hand, likely would have been proud that the school he founded was still in operation 2 centuries later and had no reason to drive students away. It would have been better had the writers come up with a plot point that perhaps Marat had been the original founder, but the school had failed under his leadership and was saved by a rival chef. Or that he had been betrayed by one of his pupils and thus held a grudge against all students. He could have even been killed in a kitchen mishap, which would explain why he was upset and determined to ruin the Academy Versailles. The writers could have even introduced the idea that Chef Marat had a hoard of secret recipes that had been lost for ages and his ghost was trying to protect their secret. That would have made for a more interesting treasure than some unrelated paintings that came to light literally at the end of the episode. Kudos to Gustav, however, for at least coming up with a costume that looked supernatural. I'm speaking, of course, about how it glowed.
You would even say it glowed.
Look at this! Phosphorus paint! Now what's that doing here?
Why would anyone want to use phosphorus paint?
Gee, I wonder. Seriously, Daphne, this is not your first rodeo. She should know exactly why there would be a gallon of phosphorus paint lying around the crime scene. Then again, this was the first time a ghost glowed in this specific Scooby series, so the Daphne of this timeline may not have run across its usage before, so perhaps she can be forgiven for being a little dim. No pun intended. Gustav also seemed to take advantage of hidden panels and dumbwaiters to unexpectedly spring up everywhere. While this doesn't equate to walking through walls, his victims might assume that was the case if he suddenly appeared out of nowhere. This is also the first ghost of a chef seen in the franchise, so 1 point for originality there. But sadly, it wasn't exactly terrifying. The ghost of Chef Marat was just a guy with long hair and a mustache. His face and eyes were normal. He didn't have claws for hands. There was nothing at all that made him look supernatural apart from the glowing effect. Original, appropriate, and with special effects, but not scary. The Ghost of Chef Marat gets a 3.5 out of 5 for the outfit. Madame La Torte is probably named after a torte, which is a dense, multi-layered cake frequently filled with what I would consider weird ingredients like nuts or jam. It's odd that the writers would use that as the basis for the character's name, as torte is a German word, and the most famous examples of that dessert are from that region. I suppose calling her Madame Soufflé would have been a bit too on the nose. What wasn't multi-layered was Gustav's actions during the episode. He appeared a few times to scare faculty members, students, and Shaggy and Scooby before ultimately getting himself captured chasing the boys. I'm not saying he should have tried kidnapping anyone, but at least that would have been something.
What's this, Daphne?
It's Pierre's missing coat! With a set of plans to the banquet room. And then, when we got too close to his trail, he stole Pierre's jacket and tried to frame him.
Gustav did try framing another faculty member by stealing their jacket and planting blueprints to the banquet hall in it. After giving this a lot of thought, I simply cannot fathom what had been going through the villain's mind when he decided to do that.
Get out!
We're here! The Academy Versailles, the oldest cooking school in France.
Leave France!
What I do?
Yeah! Like one order of cream puffs coming up!
There you are! What's going on?
A ghost, like we just saw him!
I am in the hallway minding my own business when the glowing ghost, he is knocking me over with the pastry cart and running off. He even took my jacket.
Here's the order of events in the episode. The ghost first appeared while Madame La Torte was having a cooking class. Then the gang arrived at the academy. Then the ghost chased Shaggy and Scooby, who escaped by rolling a serving trolley into their pursuer. Then they met Pierre, who complained about the theft of his jacket. At this point in the story, Daphne and the rest didn't even know what the ghost was, let alone why it would be haunting the place. The gang were no different than the faculty or students, and Gustav had no reason to suspect them of trying to investigate his haunting. He had no reason to panic and steal Pierre's coat in an impromptu attempt to frame him.
I'll check downstairs, and guys, why don't you poke around up there?
Sure thing, Daphne. Come on, Uncle Scooby. Let's grab that ghosty.
Setting aside how weird it is for Daphne to go searching on her own, as Scrappy is almost always with her when the gang splits up to investigate, he literally just ran down the stairs instead of staying up there as ordered. Why would the jacket and blueprints even matter to anyone investigating the ghost of Chef Marat? Only Gustav knew about the hidden trove of paintings or that the long-disused banquet hall was important. Sure, after the fact, if the hidden panel was found and the artwork recovered, those blueprints would have been suspicious as hell. But that presumes the plot would eventually unravel and the treasure would be found by someone other than Gustav. All he did was make the banquet hall a point of suspicion. Also, if Gustav wanted to connect Pierre's jacket with the ghost, why didn't he coat it with phosphorus paint? Finding a glowing jacket with Pierre's name tag on it would go a long way toward establishing his apparent guilt.
Madam, I saw the ghost!
I think I see something behind the counter.
What, Daphne?
Wait, I almost have it. Got it! I think we found our glowing ghost, Scrappy. The glowing onion was the final clue. This afternoon, Chef Gustav was in a hurry to get out of his ghost costume, and he splashed those onions with the phosphorus paint from his disguise.
Instead of Pierre's jacket, Gustav somehow managed to get the phosphorus paint on one of the onions that he had been seen carrying earlier. I'm not going to bother dwelling on the fact that just because one onion was found covered in phosphorus paint, it had to have been Gustav who did it. After all, the onion was found behind a counter, and there was no evidence that it was from the same batch that the chef had been carrying earlier. Instead, I'm going to ask how paint got on the onion in the first place.
Remember, when you are making the cake, add only a touch of vanilla.
Get out!
It's the ghost of Chef Marat!
And no vanilla!
I feel the same way about cilantro. Allegedly, the phosphorus paint had been transferred to the onion from Gustav's costume, which would imply that the paint had been at least wet enough for it to spread to other objects. However, throughout the episode, we saw the ghost of Chef Marat touching kitchen implements, furniture, a trolley, and the inside of a dumbwaiter. He even slid all the way down a long table covered by a tablecloth. There wasn't a drop of paint left behind on any of those surfaces. If anything, paint on the one object that Gustav had been seen touching earlier could have implied that someone had been trying to frame him as well as Pierre. It would have gone a long way toward explaining why the gallon of phosphorus paint had been left out in the open where anyone could find it. Of course, all of this is moot, considering Gustav was captured and unmasked while wearing the ghost outfit. But if that hadn't happened, proving his guilt would have been an uphill battle. Finally, though we can't know for certain, it doesn't appear as though Gustav managed to take any of the artwork out of the school. If he was resorting to dressing as a ghost and scaring others away, it's likely he was planning on removing the paintings all at the same time once the academy was empty. The fact that there were so many behind the panel implied that he had not managed to scarper off with even one.
We've come to interview Madame Letorte.
I'm afraid that is impossible.
But there must be some mistake.
There is no mistake. You will have to leave at once.
Gee, what a creep.
Well, he is, French. It's okay. I can get away with saying that, considering I have très peu viewers from that country. Gustav did very little in the episode to further his plan, and the few attempts he made at developing his plot further than just scaring people away not only ended up failing, but could only ever work toward making others that much more likely to discover the hidden treasure. He likely didn't smuggle out any of his loot. He managed to get paint on the one object that could be directly linked to him, and he ended up trapping himself at the end through a clumsy chase. He gets a 1 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the ghost of Chef Marat with a final do score of 2.5 out of 5.
Funny, you don't look French.
Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous.
This was relatively subdued, considering the efforts made by Shaggy and Scooby to alter their ethnicity in the past.
Now, as each pastry comes down the line, you're putting on the whipped cream, and you're putting the cherry on top.
Shaggy being a dirty beatnik is one thing, but just how blind was that chef? That is a hairy dog he's expecting to handle the baked goods with bare paws. I haven't seen a bakery with such lax sanitation standards since the donut shop I worked at as a teenager.
Like this thing's going a little fast for me. How about you, Scoob? Ooh, I don't know.
This looks mighty familiar. I would like to take a moment to thank my new paid supporters on Patreon and YouTube and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. The Natester. Thank you, The Natester. Or is that N.A. Tester, and you work in quality control at Morton Salt? No, it's probably The Natester. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page in the video description, or you can click the join button somewhere at the bottom of this video to become a YouTube channel member. But please only if you're comfortable doing so. Supporters receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. If you're interested in picking up some clothing or mugs, there's a link to my merch store in the video description. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I would love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. Patreon supporter Andreas Buckley added a new addition to his ongoing Scooby-inspired dollhouse remodel. This time, it's everyone's favorite pan-dimensional mode of travel. The gang accepts a mysterious invitation to ride the famous Orient Express train service. A run-in with various questionable characters results in Scooby losing a suitcase filled with Scooby snacks, and he will leave no stone unturned to find it. Unfortunately, this also leaves him vulnerable to a terrifying monster. Will Scooby get his snacks back, or will he succumb to the mummy's curse?
Scooby snacks! I love them!
Scooby is once again gorging on food without taking it out of the packaging first. This was the first of only 2 full-length episodes in this series, with all the previous ones having been divided into 2 separate 11-minute stories. Ironically, the producers somehow managed to pack less here than any one of the previous half episodes. This is despite the twist that the monster in this one, an Egyptian mummy apparently seeking vengeance against the man who desecrated its tomb, was not the actual villain. Yes, I did it again. My thumbnail and background art lied to you. This was the actual villain disguise this time around. Can you blame me for going with the more eye-catching mummy? I gotta draw in viewers.
Yeah, well, I'd love to get out of this creepy place. I think this trip's a bad idea, Daphne.
Creepy place? It's just a normal train station packed with travelers, many of which are wearing non-Western clothing. Does Shaggy have a problem with those kind of people? The Orient Express was a luxury passenger train service that ran from Paris to Istanbul for most of its time in existence. Its first run was in 1883, but with the advent of air travel, not to mention the changing geopolitical landscape experienced by Europe from the 2 world wars, the train line eventually shortened its route until ceasing operations permanently in 2009. The previous episode, Scooby a la mode, took place in Paris, which makes this one of the very few Scooby episodes where the international setting made chronological as well as geographical sense when paired with the preceding one. For example, if one plotted the travel itinerary of the gang in Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, they started out in a large US city, probably New York, then across the country to a wooded locale, likely near the western Canadian border, then more than 1,000 miles south to Hollywood, then across the country to the Florida Keys, then across the world again to Japan, then across the world again to the Grand Canyon, then 2,000 miles south to Acapulco, and so on. Do they have so many boxes of Scooby snacks because they're buying them with all their frequent flyer miles? Having the gang foil the ghost of Chef Marat in Paris, then following up with the mystery taking place aboard the Orient Express from that city, should have been an excellent way to bridge the stories, providing a welcome and long-delayed sense of continuity. Except the composition of the travelers seen in the train station ruined that illusion. If this episode began with Daphne and the rest boarding the Orient Express in Paris, it's unlikely that the majority of those in the train station would be of the ethnicity shown. Certainly, one would expect more than a few to be wearing clothing suitable for their native country if that was their destination, but they should not have been in the majority. And everyone would probably be wearing shoes as well. It looks for all the world that the gang was starting their journey from the eastern side of the Orient Express route, specifically in Turkey. There were other issues with the way the travelers were dressed. It's clear the animators wanted to evoke an exotic locale for American audiences, and an effective way to do that would be through the clothing of the background characters. However, the native outfits shown were clearly inspired by Indian fashion, not Turkish. I don't pretend to be an expert, but the turbans were also wrong. Turkey is primarily a Muslim country, while India is primarily Hindu. The turbans seen in the episode were of Hindu and Sikh design, and not Islamic. There were only 3 travelers in the station who appeared to be wearing outfits suitable for Muslim people, all in the form of generic garb suitable for North African Arabs. Setting all that aside, at the time this episode aired, in the real world, the furthest east the Orient Express traveled was primarily to Vienna, Austria, which indeed is where the train stopped at the end of the gang's journey, making a strong case that they had, in fact, departed from Paris. Those background characters at the station made no sense at all. Hell, even if the train still traveled as far as Turkey, there had been 2 major earthquakes in that country just a few months prior to when this episode aired, which would have likely impacted international travel.
Like the train can't be any creepier than the stations. We shall see.
Where Scooby-Doo was the series' attempt at creating a mystery inspired by Agatha Christie detective novels, specifically Murder on the Orient Express, but with zero effort toward being contemporary. I suppose that's not that big of a deal when you consider how nobody in the show bats an eye at 2 talking dogs. Most of the characters featured this time around were inspired by classic detective novels and films. Sidney Gasper resembles the fez-wearing Ferrari in Casablanca, with his name being both a nod to the actor who played him, Sidney Greenstreet, and another noir character played by that same actor, Caspar Gutman, in The Maltese Falcon. The unnamed little guy was obviously meant to be Peter Lorre, both in his look and manner of speech, which was appropriate as he also starred in the aforementioned Maltese Falcon along with Greenstreet. Dr. Natasha is more difficult for me to place as I'm no expert in film noir. She could be simply a nod toward the femme fatale type character seen in many of the stories that inspired this episode, or even a throwback to Natasha from Rocky and Bullwinkle. She had the accent for it. Or did she? Because it was all over the place.
Okay, one more test. Cover your eyes and count to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Natasha's name was Russian, and her accent was definitely reminiscent of Eastern Europe. However, she started counting in German before ending in English. The actor was clearly trying to punch above her weight class when it came to accents. Why didn't the producers get June Foray, the actual voice of Natasha from Rocky and Bullwinkle, for this role? Despite not being credited, I'm fairly certain she voiced Dracula's wife in the last episode. The final character, Beatrice Whimsy, was the one most clearly inspired by the works of Agatha Christie, in particular Miss Marple, generally depicted in pop culture as an elderly woman wearing a hat and old-fashioned lady's jacket. Whimsy is also seen knitting, which was an activity frequently enjoyed by Christie's aged detective.
Help me, please! Someone, anyone, help me, please!
What's wrong with them?
It's the mummy!
The mummy!
As mentioned, it was first established that a mummy was going to be the principal antagonist before the viewers had the rug pulled out from under them with the reveal that the monster was actually the disguise of one of the members of the Mystery Club, an alliance of successful detectives who wanted to invite Daphne and the rest to join their ranks, with the mummy shenanigans acting both as an initiation and test of the gang's deductive powers.
Where did the suitcase of knitting come from?
Oh no, my Scooby snacks are gone.
You've got to retrieve your Scooby snacks!
I'm on my way.
Look at this. One of those sweaters fell out, and it's knitted all lopsided.
Actually, I think that just means Scooby switched suitcases with Morticia Addams. The initiation test involves swapping Scooby's suitcase filled with Scooby snacks with one belonging to a member of the Mystery Club. That case contained clues pointing to its owner, who Scooby then tracked down, only to find their case had been swapped with one from another member, forcing the dog to continuously search the train. This eventually ended with Scooby being kidnapped by the group so that Daphne and the rest could come to his rescue.
Gotta find Scooby snacks. Anything in here? Nobody there. Oh, nothing in here either.
Talk about an invasion of privacy. Worst dog owners ever.
Daphne, Shaggy, look!
It's Scooby's collar.
Oh no! Scooby's been kidnapped!
I've got a list of passengers from the conductor.
Good, like one of these people must have kidnapped Scooby.
Jesus! Has anyone heard about privacy on this train? Worst train staff ever. What the group of detectives didn't know was that one of their members was, in actuality, a spy who had recently absconded with a secret formula for fuel stolen from a laboratory where they had been posing as a scientist. This spy was, in fact, Beatrice Whimsy, who was secretly a much younger woman disguised as an aged spinster.
We'll start the questioning with Beatrice Whimsy. Was her knitting stuff in that other suitcase?
How exactly did Daphne know that? Whimsy did not give her name when she met the gang earlier in the episode, and the passenger list wouldn't provide descriptions, only names and room numbers.
Leave it to me, Daphne. Detective Scrappy always gets the bad guys. All right, Whimsy, free.
Oh, hello. May I help you?
Nope. Privacy is not a thing on the Orient Express. This episode was not a case of two separate villains operating their schemes at the same time, like how Penrod Stillwell dressed as a headless ghost to frighten away intruders while he searched his mansion for his family's treasure, as his neighbor, Asa Shanks, did the exact same thing with a napkin on his head. The spy was never given an actual name in the episode, so I will continue to call her by her fake name of Whimsy. Though perhaps I could call her Julie Vanaugh because they look so much alike. Did Julie's hotel go under and she was desperate enough for cash that she turned to industrial espionage? Or did her family just have a streak of criminality running through it, and it took a while after Uncle Leon was busted for it to show up in her as well?
I was busy knitting when this odd porter came in. He thought I might have gotten the wrong suitcase by mistake, and he was right.
That sweater should not have been in the suitcase. Daphne was still holding it after Scooby left their room earlier to begin his search. Whimsy also had to have established herself as a detective to infiltrate the Mystery Club, which, along with being able to disguise herself as a scientist and join the lab where she stole the formula, signifies an extreme level of planning seldom seen in most Scooby villain schemes. I am left wondering, though, whether Whimsy had always been a spy and pretended to be a scientist, or had she been a scientist who decided to become a spy? or had she taken the place of a real scientist who worked at the laboratory? To infiltrate the lab as herself, Whimsy would have had to forge employment papers to give to whoever was responsible for hiring, which would have included her educational background as well as any prior laboratories she would have used as a reference. For the theft of the formula to make front-page news as shown, the lab had to have been an important one, likely doing work for the government or aerospace industry. This would imply a level of background vetting much more stringent than most companies, making it that much harder for Whimsy to fake her credentials. To replace one of the real scientists would have meant successfully kidnapping or, as well as disguising herself as her victim to fool everyone else at the lab. This would have taken Mission Impossible levels of makeup and vocal training. I do lean toward Whimsy having infiltrated the lab as herself, however, despite it being much harder to do, considering the newspapers had her photo. If she had replaced a legitimate scientist, her real face would have remained unknown. Or rather, she would not have looked like the photo of the missing scientist on the front page. Either of these, evading the laboratory employment screening or replacing an established scientist, implies Whimsy was extremely competent. Or she could have always been a real scientist all along who decided to steal from her employer to seek a large payday from a foreign power or competing laboratory.
Daphne, grab my hand! Gee, Daphne, like you should try using some hand lotion. Your skin is just like...
Wait a minute. Who's that on top of the train? That would be Shaggy, Scooby, and Whimsy, even though Shaggy is still inside the train with the mummy. The animator snagged cells meant for much later in the episode when the boys and the villain confronted each other after the unmasking. Early 1980s Hanna-Barbera did not give a fuck. Whimsy's disguise as the elderly detective would have been risky as well, considering membership in the Mystery Club implied the other members should have the necessary deductive skills to recognize if someone tried to join them using false credentials. In fact, she risked more than just being denied entry to the group, as any one of the club members would have been curious why someone had tried to join them under false pretenses. That could then lead them to discovering her plot to steal the fuel formula. As was the case for infiltrating the lab, did Whimsy go through the elaborate trouble of establishing herself as a formidable detective solving cases all over the world? Or did she simply abduct and replace the real Beatrice Whimsy? While the gang spent their time avoiding the mummy on the Orient Express, was the real spinster spending her time in a locked room somewhere, regaling a fellow kidnapped young female scientist with stories of her detective work while the two awaited rescue? Or were the two of them sharing the same isolated spot in the woods outside town, awaiting their shallow graves to be unearthed by scavenging forest animals? That got dark. I could, of course, be overthinking the effectiveness of the members of the Mystery Club, considering they felt an anonymous letter and a living mummy, not to mention a musical chairs-type mystery involving a suitcase filled with Scooby snacks, was an adequate test of the acumen of potential new members to their group. Industrial espionage and stolen formulas are nothing new in the Scooby-Doo-niverse, but neither is lost treasure or hidden underground resources. And as promised, I won't be focusing so much on this being unoriginal when factoring the ranking. Frankly, infiltrating a lab for the original theft and then infiltrating an unrelated group for the getaway feels sufficiently unique, and clearly there was a market for the purloined formula considering the media coverage, which makes Whimsy's scheme very lucrative. She gets a 4.5 out of 5 for the design. Whether I decided to rate the mystery group's mummy costume or Whimsy's elderly lady disguise doesn't really matter, as neither one was impressive. Not only have we seen mummies before in the franchise, but Dr. Najib's mummy of Anka had the same flap of cloth behind its head, the trail of bandage hanging from its arm, and at one time, even a flap of bandage trailing behind its leg. It's like the animators were told to use the same design, but make it 30% cheaper and 80% less frightening.
When I entered the dining car, I was greeted by a rather odd maitre d'.
Good evening, sir. Table for two?
One.
A decade after the Mama Cass episode, and the Scooby writers still aren't sick of fat jokes.
Rats! Next I was joined by a most ravishing creature.
And hold me, boy. Mind if I join you?
Were the animators trying to make Scooby look like Dolly Parton? He's been in drag before, but never with cans that large.
Egad, let go of the emergency brake!
Back in the day, passengers were able to pull stop cords on trains that directly linked to the emergency brake system. Whereas these days, most emergency levers link to the conductor who assesses the situation before stopping the train. In either case, though, letting go of the emergency cord wouldn't restart movement. It would take a manual reset of the brake system by train personnel before resuming the journey. But that's neither here nor there. What really bugged me about this scene was how the mummy was behind Scooby before he pulled the cord and went flying forward when the train stopped. Then, when the train started up again, the monster was flung backward towards Scooby, but somehow still disappeared. Whimsy's elderly detective disguise was simply a mask meant to hide her identity and not to frighten or otherwise come across as a supernatural threat. It's not a Scooby costume in the traditional sense and cannot be judged that way. Both disguises did at least do the job their wearers intended, with the mummy scaring Shaggy and Scooby, while Whimsy's allowed her to infiltrate the Mystery Club. I would love to penalize the mummy as being cheap, unoriginal, and not very frightening, but that costume was not the one to analyze here, as the true villain was Beatrice Whimsy. Which would make this another one of those episodes where there just wasn't a get-up to rate. It was still technically a disguise, and it did its job, but nothing about it was impressive enough to lift its score any higher than if the bad guy had been wearing no disguise at all. Thus, it gets the usual middle-of-the-road 2.5 out of 5. Before I get into Whimsy's operation, first a dishonorable mention for the Mystery Club's mummy scheme. I understand they were trying to test the gang's ability to solve mysteries, but what kind of conundrum is a swapped suitcase? Each one contained obvious clues as to the owner's identity, and the mummy only ever seemed to appear after Scooby had seen what he needed to see. In fact, Scooby was the only one actually following the suitcase trail. All Daphne, Shaggy, and Scrappy did was interrogate the members of the Mystery Club who told them where to go next. Even after Scooby had been kidnapped, one of the members told Shaggy that the gang already had all the information they needed to find their missing dog. I've played video games on easy mode that didn't hold my hand as much as this.
Rabbit! 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 Oh no! What's that? Look, it's me, Scooby!
The gang realized Scooby had been abducted because his collar had been left behind. But when he turned up later locked in the sarcophagus, he was wearing it again. I suppose we chalk that up to him having a spare in the old pocket dimension. Incidentally, the Mystery Club had been trying to recruit Daphne and the rest. Isn't it insane that would include kidnapping their dog? Even Scientology waits until after you sign up before abducting your loved ones. Now, as for the actual villain plot in the episode, Whimsy's design was brilliant, but her follow-through was quite flawed. Let's start with the positives first.
Someone clever enough to translate the fuel formulas into code. See this sweater? It's knitted in Morse code. Long stitches and short stitches.
Rather than run the risk of her luggage being searched and the secret formula being found, Whimsy cleverly encoded the formula within the clothing she knitted, using long and short stitches to represent the dashes and dots of Morse code. This was reminiscent of Madame Defarge from A Tale of Two Cities, incorporating a hit list within her knitting projects. And that's it. That's the extent of the positive things I have to say about Whimsy's actions. She may have successfully stolen the fuel formula from the lab and infiltrated the Mystery Club, but all that happened prior to the events in the episode. What we saw of her actions in the show itself made me question how she managed to do those first two things, considering how dumb she was later on.
Extra! Extra! New formula stolen! Huh? And my newspapers were stolen too! We got lost in the dark.
And we stumbled into a room down the hall.
Look what we found.
A whole stack of newspapers. And somebody's torn the same article out of all of them.
What?
Who? Us? Oh no! The same person who tried to keep us all from seeing this article.
What was the point of stealing the newspapers or tearing out her photo from them? The formula theft was a major news item, apparently, which meant that multiple newspapers would be covering the story, let alone other media like radio and television. Did Whimsy think she could snag every newspaper in the city? That was Harvey Korman's stupid plan in High Anxiety. Was Whimsy worried about her face being on the page? If so, why? She was disguised as an old woman. Provided she kept her mask on during the duration of the train trip, nobody would know she was the missing scientist. All stealing the newspapers and tearing out her photo did was to create needless suspicion for anyone who came across them. Whimsy's second mistake was allowing the suitcase containing her precious knitting to be used as part of the Mystery Club's initiation test for the gang. I get why all four of them needed to provide something that would link the suitcases to each other, but why would Whimsy include her finished sweaters, the ones with the secret formula encoded in them, in the suitcase she swapped with Scooby? The Orient Express was a luxury line, so she would have been expected to have carried more than one piece of luggage. Why didn't she keep her spools of yarn and her needles in the red suitcase meant to test the gang, while her finished clothing was safely locked in a separate bag? Even worse, the sweaters she knitted were just weird. They had multiple necks and arms for no reason. It wasn't like using the long and short stitches as code would have required the extraneous limbs on the finished clothing. There was more than enough room on the back and chest, and guess what? If she had run out of room, all she had to do was continue the formula on another sweater. The weird design only drew attention to the clothing she was desperately trying to avoid drawing attention toward. Indeed, the weird sweaters answered a question I had while watching the episode. Whimsy never once acted suspiciously in front of Daphne or Scrappy. So how did Daphne realize that the sweaters were conveying a secret message? Is it possible that while staring at the odd shape, she also happened to take a long look at the stitching pattern and recognized it was Morse code? If Whimsy had fashioned traditional sweaters or even scarves instead of the insane things she did, Daphne may never have scrutinized the knitting as much as she did, and likely would never have noticed the hidden message.
You kids are pretty smart, but you'll never catch me!
Zoink! Stop her!
She's getting away!
No, with my Scooby snacks!
Finally, when the jig was up and she was outed as a spy, Whimsy correctly ran from the scene. That's a good thing. However, she grabbed Scooby's suitcase filled with Scooby snacks instead of her own. Even if she had managed to get away from the gang and the rest of the Mystery Club, she would have had nothing to show for it. I also questioned why she pulled off her own mask. At this point, all anyone knew was the old lady may not have been who she claimed to be. Whimsy should have kept the mask on so nobody would have been able to get a good look at her real face. Until she was in custody, even the authorities wouldn't know for certain that the missing scientist was a spy. If Whimsy's real face had never been seen under the mask, the police might eventually question whether the scientist was the one they even needed to be looking for, or if instead she had been the real victim of whoever made off with the formula. In fact, if Whimsy had kidnapped either the real Whimsy or scientist, she could have killed either one of them, or both, leaving behind corpses that would further confuse the authorities, perhaps even convincing them that the spy was dead. I'm also curious why Whimsy was still knitting the encoded sweaters in the station and on the train. Was she still writing out the secret formula from memory so that the sweaters would be passed on to her contact for whatever organization was purchasing it from her? She wasn't reading from any paperwork. Wouldn't she have already transferred everything to the sweaters before going missing from the lab? After all, once she left, she wouldn't have access to any of the documentation if she had forgotten anything important about the formula.
Rats, this door is locked.
Maybe there's another entrance.
Yeah, but finding it could take all night. Short night, wasn't it?
Oh no, we're locked in.
Wait a minute. Scrappy banged on the door and said it was locked, but it easily opened when Shaggy simply leaned on it. Then, when they went inside the compartment, the door closed behind them and Daphne gasped that they were locked in, despite not even trying to open it first. This was one of the only 2 stories in this season that took place over a full 22 minutes and not a mere 11, and yet the writers still didn't seem to have enough time for anything to make any sense.
Yikes! Be careful, Scoob!
So long, Super Sleuth!
Gotcha, Scoob!
Whimsy did think fast when it came to uncoupling the rail cars, so her pursuers would be left far behind while she escaped, but she screwed up by allowing Scooby to hold the train together. If she had kicked the dog's legs off the edge, the rear cars may have been left miles behind. Not that the conductor wouldn't immediately stop and go back to reconnect with them, as it wasn't just a single car, but literally half of the train. But perhaps that would have afforded Whimsy enough time to find another way to safely reach her hideout. Whimsy did an excellent job concealing the stolen formula, but everything else she did was just dumb. She used her encoded sweaters as bait instead of keeping them securely hidden, outed herself without needing to, and failed to secure her escape route. She gets a 2 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves Beatrice Whimsy with a final do score of 3 out of 5.
Aha! Denying the truth, eh? Hiding the evidence, eh? Well, I'll get...
It's the wedding day of Shaggy's sister, so he and the rest of the gang return to his family home in New England to attend the festivities. The joyous reunion is cut short, however, by the malevolent spirit of a long-dead ancestor, a disagreeable Puritan who is out to reclaim a ring that once belonged to him. Will Shaggy's sister and her groom be able to say "I do," or will the wedding be canceled because the ghost insists on saying "I boo"? Oh, come on. The title of the episode featured a pun that was just as bad.
Yuck! What's that awful smell?
Well, considering Scooby's diet.
Hang on, Uncle Scooby. I'll pull it off.
I've asked this before, but again, just how massive is the back of the Mystery Machine? Pocket dimensions are everywhere in the Scooby-Doo-universe. Alex Anders was hired by the Rogers family to photograph the wedding of Shaggy's sister Maggie to her fiancé Wilfred. What nobody knew, however, was that Anders was actually the latest descendant of a 17th century pilgrim named Alexander, who had been a bitter rival of Mick Baggy Rogers, the first of their family in North America, and who arrived on the Mayflower. The nature of the quarrel was over a secret treasure allegedly buried by McBaggy Rogers and coveted by Alexander and his heirs for well over the past 3 centuries.
What you reading, Daphne?
It's the history of Plymouth by Jonas Potter. I found it on the shelf. It says that McBaggy Rogers came to America on the Mayflower with his dog, Yankee Doodle Doo.
For those in my audience who aren't aware, the Mayflower was a ship used by religious separatists who fled England to North America in 1620, where they founded a colony at what would eventually become Plymouth, Massachusetts, the setting for this episode. They did so because they felt the authorities in their native country were too strict in imposing restrictions on their religious freedoms. So they traveled 3,000 miles away to a new land where they could strictly impose their own restrictions on everyone else's religious freedoms. You've heard of the Salem witch trials, where a couple of dozen innocent people were hanged or tortured to death? Yeah, that was these people. In real life, there were 2 passengers on the Mayflower named Rogers, Thomas and his son Joseph. Sadly, Thomas died of disease during the first winter, less than 2 months after they arrived. But Joe survived and apparently led a long and successful life. Good for him! It's hard not to root for someone with that name, isn't it? It's highly unlikely in any case that anyone named McBaggy would have arrived on the Mayflower. That name would suggest he had been either Irish or Scottish, while the passengers on the Mayflower were likely all English. To put it in terms my fellow Americans would find easier to understand, it would be like someone telling you they went to Burger King for lunch where they enjoyed some nice McDonald's French fries. Yeah, it's all fast food, but they're not all from the same place. Less unlikely would be McBaggy Rogers' dog Yankee Doodle Doo having been on the ship, as historical records indicate that at least 2 dogs accompanied the Pilgrims on their journey to the New World. I can't help but think how fortuitous it was that the Native Americans aided the poorly prepared religious kooks to survive the harsh New England winter environment. Otherwise, instead of turkey, roast spaniel may have become the traditional Thanksgiving meal.
In my room, I saw it! It was a ghost!
A ghost? Now, Maggie, calm down. You're just nervous because we're getting married today.
What a great start for their new life together, where the husband is already downplaying his wife's concerns.
Shaggy, I'm really glad you and Daphne came. There's something really strange going on around here. No, not them. Something stranger. I saw a ghost.
Now, Maggie, you're just like nervous about your wedding.
This came out of nowhere and led nowhere. It's like the writers used a shotgun filled with ink to just blast ideas all over the script. But I do love Wilfred's expression. That's the face of a guy who is just now starting to realize exactly what his future looks like being part of the Rogers family. I probably had that same look on my face the first time I met my second wife's family and saw all the NASCAR shit in their house.
Don't worry, honey. There are no ghosts.
Zoinkers! He's the ghost I saw!
But there aren't any ghosts, honey.
Then again, it's not like Maggie is really coming out the winner with her new husband either. After their first child, is he going to tell her it's all in her head when she starts to complain about being extremely depressed?
Check this out, gang. It's McBaggy Rogers' diary. It says McBaggy buried a priceless Indian treasure somewhere on this property. It also says a rival pilgrim named Alexander tried to steal the map to the treasure.
But McBaggy hid the map behind the stone that glitters.
At some point prior to the wedding day, Anders had found a hidden room in the cellar of the Rogers mansion where he discovered McBaggy Rogers' diary. Inside that, he learned that a map to the hidden treasure was hidden behind, quote, the stone that glitters. Anders deduced this referred to the diamond on the gold ring once owned by McBaggy Rogers and passed down through the family.
Ooh, wow! What a gorgeous wedding ring!
It's been in our family for centuries. The wedding ring first belonged to our pilgrim ancestor, McBaggy Rogers.
McBaggy Rogers was a Puritan, and Puritans hated just about everything, including showing off one's wealth. While some might have kept a few family keepsakes that incidentally contained some gold, it is extremely unlikely any would have had a diamond ring, particularly as that gemstone was much more rare and valuable than today. In fact, Puritans didn't even wear wedding rings, as that practice was considered to be too Catholic for their tastes. Anders apparently decided it would be easier to get his hands on the heirloom if Maggie never took possession, so he dressed as the ghost of McBaggy Rogers to scare the family into canceling or delaying the nuptials for him to steal it. That's the extent of Anders' scheme, which was essentially Gustav's plot from 2 episodes ago, with the bad guy finding a valuable secret and clumsily scaring others away so they could take it for themselves. Dressing as a ghost to do this was particularly stupid this time around, as there was already a much better method by which Anders could have accomplished his goal. But I'll go over that later in the operations section.
Like, let's see this Indian treasure already. Like it's corn on the cob.
For the Pilgrims, it was the greatest treasure of all.
The Indian corn grew into large crops, and that meant the Pilgrims would never go hungry again.
At the end of the episode, we learned that the secret treasure had no monetary value, which would make Anders' actions pointless. But to be fair, he didn't know that at the time. So, like Schrodinger's cat creature, the villain's plan was both valuable and worthless at the same time until it was finally unearthed. Nevertheless, for the purposes of my ranking, I will consider it worth the risk of getting caught.
Amazing! And pretty tasty, too!
Even setting aside that ears of corn would not have survived centuries buried in a box in a damp cave, that's not what the corn would have looked like back in the Pilgrim days. Modern corn is very different from what the grain looked like in the 1600s, when the kernels would have been hard and multicolored. It was also not eaten off the cob like that, but rather dried and ground into meal. Yuck! Indeed.
Oh, no!
Like some joke, huh?
Uncle Gaggy!
This may have been played for laughs, but Shaggy and Scooby's parents are well into their middle ages. Shocks like that could lead to a literal heart attack, let alone falling from a tree. I'm in my early 50s, and that's the kind of stuff you think about when you get this old.
We've been fooled again, Scrappy.
Pretty good joke, eh, Daphne?
Did everyone forget there was a wedding scheduled that day? Why is Shaggy's Uncle Gaggy scurrying around like this when he could be upstairs helping? Saying Anders' plan was worth the risk may not be saying much, as his scheme didn't really seem to be that dangerous. Provided he didn't do something that could potentially harm anyone at the Rogers mansion, at worst, if he was caught, he might be arrested for trespassing or criminal intimidation, and neither charge would be likely to stick. A reasonably good lawyer could successfully argue that, as the wedding photographer, Anders had already been granted access to the estate, and nothing legally precluded him from doing so dressed as a ghost. Additionally, twice in the episode, Uncle Gaggy and his dog Whoopsie-Doo dressed as ghosts or monsters themselves to frighten the rest of the family. Anders could contend that as far as he knew, this was simply how they did things in the Rogers family, so why should he be arrested for it?
What are you nuts doing up there, looking for squirrels? Or are you squirrels looking for nuts? Get it? Squirrels, nuts.
If anything, unearthing the old McBaggy Rogers treasure and finding out it was worthless would be a good way to finally bury the hatchet between Shaggy's family and the descendants of Alexander the Pilgrim. It would have been a nice lesson to the children in the audience about the nature of forgiveness and mercy during times of joy, like a wedding or holidays. Then again, the Rogers family was founded by a grumpy Puritan, so words like forgiveness and mercy may not even be in their vocabulary. Anders' plan was valuable, until it wasn't, nor was it that risky, either physically or legally, and it was as unique as any other Scooby villain scheme at the time. Meaning not that very. So he could say 2.5 out of 5 for the design. The ghost of McBaggy Rogers was an interesting choice for Anders, as would be any spirit of a family member tormenting its descendants. Typically, the souls of the dead haunt a house because it was tied to them in some way, either because they spent their lives there, or they died there, or otherwise some powerful emotional event happened which bound them to the location. Cursing an entire lineage usually denotes a deep grudge held by the ghost against the family when it was alive. Thus, it would have made a lot more sense for the ghost in the episode to have been the specter of Alexander, the pilgrim who had the grudge against the Rogers family. McBaggy Rogers was, after all, a distant ancestor of Maggie, so you'd think that not only would he not try to disrupt her wedding, but he would actually approve of anything that would make her happy. Then again, he was a Puritan, so he being upset over what he might consider a blasphemous ceremony could make sense, especially if it took place in his ancestral mansion. Indeed, using McBaggy Rogers as the ghost could have served double duty for Anders. It not only established a connection to the family's ring, but it would dishonor McBaggy Rogers' memory if his spirit was so awful that it would ruin the wedding of one of his descendants. This also raises the question as to why, after over 300 years, did the ghost of McMaggie Rogers choose the day of the wedding to take back his ring? It would be one thing if the Rogers family had told tales of the ghost appearing periodically to demand its return, but the spirit emanating only once and right now feels somewhat capricious and thus suspicious. The ghost of McMaggie Rogers did not feature any special effects, and the entirety of its supernatural nature was conveyed through white clothing and a mask. It didn't glow, float, or walk through walls. In fact, that it could only seem to travel through doorways or secret wall panels should have been enough of a clue to the gang that it wasn't a real specter. Ironically, Gaggy Rogers included more supernatural effects when he was pranking his nephew than the actual villain did in the episode. It's also difficult to claim that the McMaggie Rogers costume was very frightening. He was just a guy who looked like Shaggy, but all white and with RBF. Unless, of course, you're afraid of pilgrims. Which actually, considering all the crap the Puritans did, is fairly understandable. Grumpy, but not scary. Appropriate, but not really. And with zero special effects, the ghost of McMaggie Rogers gets an outfit score of 2 out of 5. The single biggest flaw of Anders' operation was just how unnecessary it all was. Like a Jurassic Park geneticist, he seemed more focused on whether a ghost would work for his scheme, rather than if he should even attempt it. The perfect solution was right in front of him the entire time.
Here's the map to the Indian treasure. According to the map, the Indian treasure is buried inside this cave.
The only reason Anders was at the wedding was because he had been hired as a photographer for the ceremony. By this point, he had already found the hidden room in the basement and knew he needed the heirloom to find the treasure's location. Rather than trying to get the wedding canceled, which would mean they wouldn't need a photographer anymore and he would lose his excuse for being at the mansion, he should have found a way to be alone with the ring. For example, he could have asked Shaggy's father to borrow it for some photos. He was, after all, the man they hired to record the wedding, so they should have trusted him enough to allow access to all aspects of the ceremony, which would presumably include the wedding rings. After receiving it, he could make an excuse about needing to switch lenses, go out to his car where nobody was looking, open the ring to take the map, and then head back inside with no one the wiser.
Ooh! That's me! Whoopsie-doo! Cousin Scooby!
You know, I think I'm beginning to miss having Scrappy on screen more. I might be too harsh on Anders, as we don't know when he discovered the secret room or diary, nor when he figured out that the ring was the answer to McMaggie Rogers' riddle. He could have very recently learned what he needed, and the approaching wedding made him desperate and sloppy. However, he seemingly had enough time to create a costume and lifelike mask to terrorize the Rogers family, which was time he could have spent otherwise finding a less obtrusive way to get hold of the heirloom.
Oh, and Shaggy, you're the best man. Here, hold on to the ring until the ceremony. Like sure thing, Pop.
Oh, giving Shaggy the wedding ring to hold on to. That's going to end well. Wait a minute. Shaggy was the best man? Really? Was he a friend of Wilfred all these years and nobody mentioned it? Or was Wilfred a very lonely person with few acquaintances and Maggie suggested having Shaggy take on the duty? There was one single shot that showed a lot of guests, but at no point did we see Wilfred's parents or any obvious family members. There were 3 unnamed background characters at the wedding itself who appeared to be his groomsmen: a portly black man, a Hispanic man, and an Asian man, but nobody that looked like a relative. If nothing else, his parents, siblings, or close cousins should have been in the room with everyone else while they discussed how to handle the haunting. If Wilfred was that isolated, I suppose to him, even the Rogers family must have looked good. Incidentally, a paper map hidden in a secret compartment of a ring was easily one of the stupidest things I've yet seen in the entire franchise. When first shown, the diamond was large, but still of reasonable size, until later on, when, through the usual sloppy Hanna-Barbera quality control, the stone was suddenly twice as large and the bridge itself big enough to hold a tightly folded piece of paper. This was such a ham-fisted way for the writers to hide a map on a ring, when the obvious choice would have been to have the directions to the treasure engraved inside the band, which would still have been considered behind the glittering stone. The inscription could have even been written in code that would have required even further deduction on the part of Daphne and the rest, and making for a more interesting story. But then presumably, we would not have had time for scenes like this. Anders may not have known the map was inside the ring, or if the clue was part of the inscription on the band, which was all the more reason for him to get very detailed photographs of it. Hell, he didn't even need to keep the map, especially as he couldn't know if the Rogers family already knew about it and would notice if it was taken. All he had to do was snap a few photos of it like a secret agent in a spy film and put it back inside the ring to avoid suspicion. That's assuming he would even need that much time to decipher it, considering Daphne found the treasure's location immediately after reading the map. Afterward, Anders should have finished his job as the wedding photographer and returned later when everyone was asleep to dig up the treasure. That would have been the absolute best method to avoid any suspicion.
Whoops, there goes the ring!
Why, thank you, Mr. Ghost. Mr. Ghost!
What in the hemorrhaging f***? The sole reason for Anders to dress up as the ghost of McMaggie Rogers was to get hold of the ring so he could find the treasure. He just had it in his hand. Why did he give it back to Scooby? Is this one of those cartoon laws that a character must do the wrong thing if it's funny? Like how Roger Rabbit had to wait until it was funny before he could slip out of the handcuffs? Getting back to potential reasons for McMaggie Rogers to haunt a wedding, his hatred for ceremonies as a Puritan should have been why he tried to disrupt things, rather than wanting to get hold of the heirloom. Let's say Shaggy's dad did hand the thing over to the ghost. What then? Where would an incorporeal entity even put such a thing? Specters generally can't wear physical objects. As far as any covetous Casper would be concerned, the important thing would be to keep the object of its desire in its sphere of influence rather than on its person, as there was no longer a person to hold it. In this case, as long as the ring stayed within the Rogers mansion, the ghost would have no reason to be upset. Thus, Anders should have made canceling the wedding the spirit's sole motivation, because that would have been enough to keep it away from Maggie's finger and in the house, where it would be much easier to examine or steal.
But where are we going, Daphne?
To the cellar to get to the bottom of this ghost hoax.
How massive is that basement? I get that the Rogers estate is huge, but that is what you get with a castle, not a colonial mansion.
It's the secret chamber, and Uncle Scooby found it.
Again?
Why was the secret room so brightly lit from just a single candle? And why was it so clean in there? There was no dust or spider webs. Also, that book was just lying there, presumably for well over 300 years, and was still in pristine condition. Basements in Massachusetts are frequently damp due to weather and high water tables, particularly in old stonework like that. The diary should have been an unreadable wad of wet wood pulp and mold.
Hey, what's this plastic lid doing here?
That's strange. The Pilgrims didn't have plastic.
They also didn't have garishly colored clothing like what's hanging up behind Daphne.
Like it's Alexander's!
Exactly. The plastic lid we found in the secret chamber gave him away. It's the lens cap to Mr. Anders' camera.
The gang found the lens cap much earlier, even before they explored the cave and found the secret treasure. If Daphne knew the bad guy was Anders all along, why didn't she say so sooner? I think that deep down, she knows she's not as smart as Velma, and lied that she knew who the bad guy was before he was unmasked.
Uh-oh! Zoinks! Like what gives? Somebody locked us in!
While not a fatal mistake, Anders having locked the gang in the basement was definitely a big one. Not only did it lead to them finding the hidden room and diary, but also the lost lens cap, which allegedly clued Daphne in as to the real identity of the ghost of McBaggy Rogers. So why did Anders lock them in the basement? It didn't seem to have a point, unless he thought having Shaggy trapped down there would make it easier to steal the ring.
It's the ghost! Everybody out of here!
Run for the ride!
They all just ran out of the basement with no problem. I suppose when Shaggy said they were locked in, he meant just the opposite. That's 2 episodes in a row that ignore what it means for a door to be locked. Before concluding this section, I want to mention something that has always bugged me about cartoons and comics. Why do Shaggy's parents look identical? It's one thing if either one of them was their son's doppelganger. My own son is a dead ringer for how I looked when I was in my late teens. I was much skinnier back then and had hair, so don't feel too bad for him. But the similarity between Mr. and Mrs. Rogers goes a step beyond uncanny to downright disturbing. They look more like siblings than a married couple. If it hadn't been established that this episode was set in Massachusetts, I'd have just assumed it was Alabama. Going further, Maggie Rogers looked nothing like her parents, her uncle, or her brother. Was she adopted? Or is this one of those Marilyn Munster things where the monster gene skips a generation? Either way, it's going to be interesting to see what her kids end up looking like. Of course, there's always the possibility that there had been some freaky 1970s swinger-type shenanigans happening in the Plymouth adult rural community. At least Scooby's family looking exactly alike makes a lot more sense, as inbreeding Great Danes is a fairly common practice. Recessive genes in the Doo line would go a long way toward explaining why Scrappy is several years old and still puppy-sized. It would also explain a lot of his personality, too. Anders had plenty of opportunities to either steal the ring or at least get enough time alone with it to glean the information he needed to find the treasure. But instead, he needlessly dressed as a ghost to try and ruin the wedding. He clumsily dropped an item in a sensitive area where he would later trap others, giving them ample opportunity to find the clue. And he literally had the ring in his hand before stupidly giving it back to the gang. He gets a 1 out of 5 for the operation. The ghost of McBaggy Rogers, the last villain featured this season, stumbles into a disappointing final due score of 1.8 out of 5.
Oh boy! Like I never knew these tuxedos were so tricky to put on! Like run for it, Scoob!
No! Scooby, what's the meaning of this?
On the one hand, I'm impressed that the animators actually showed the tuxedo being washed away to explain why suddenly Shaggy is wearing his usual clothes. On the other hand, why was Shaggy wearing his usual clothes under his tuxedo? Gee, I wonder why he had so much trouble getting dressed earlier. By the way, this has to be one of the most awkward frames I've yet to run across in the entire time I've been doing these Scooby videos. The animators had to have known, right?
Where's Uncle Scooby going?
Well, you don't expect the bride to go on her honeymoon without her wedding ring.
The new couple is going to have a very awkward wedding night. And that's my ranking of the villains from the final set of episodes of the first season of the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. Unfortunately, despite a decent showing for Beatrice Whimsy, at least when it comes to this series, the ghost of McBaggy Rogers ended things on a disappointing note. As you can see from the scores scrolling next to me, the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show was an overall lackluster effort by Hanna-Barbera when it comes to the quality of their villains, with most falling below average in the rankings. As usual, I'm planning on taking a small break before covering the next series, the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries, by returning to the Red Shirt Shaggy films with Scooby-Doo and the Ghoul School. I also have a quick announcement to make about a minor change for my channel going forward. I've decided to retire my passive-aggressive spoiler warning. While I have had a few viewers mention that they enjoy that segment, and my apologies to those who do, it's been getting more and more difficult to come up with these things, and they don't add that much to my videos. I only ever started the bit in a fit of pique after the comments section of one of my earliest videos had been hammered with complaints for not including a spoiler warning at the beginning of it, despite the show I was discussing having been, at that time, nearly 10 years old. Well, it's been 5 years since that video, so I figured that maybe it was time for me to just let it go.
Let it go, let it go.
I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, or you can become one of my YouTube channel members by clicking the join button. But please only if you're comfortable doing so. Supporters receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. There's also a link to my merch store where you can pick up clothing or mugs. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I would love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. I'm not kidding about my second wife and her family's NASCAR obsession. After one of their favorite drivers died in a helicopter crash, they literally turned part of their living room into a shrine to his memory.